Yeah, let's get started. Hi everyone. I'm Emma Sayer. I'm senior editor at Functional Ecology, and I normally mostly teach these workshops in person, and they're normally quite a bit longer than we've got in the next two sessions. So I'm going to try and concentrate on sort of the fundamentals for writing a really good paper. And a lot of the techniques that I'm going to show you, I mean, some of them might sound a bit obvious, but often, and in my experience as a supervisor of PhD students and postdocs, but also as an editor, there are certain things that may seem obvious when you point them out, but an awful lot of researchers miss them when they're writing papers. And this is quite simply the nature of our work. We get really absorbed in our work and in our studies, and it's often quite difficult to take a step back and think about what we're really doing when we're trying to write. I welcome questions throughout. If something isn't clear to you, please use the hand up button to let me know, or put a question in the chat. It's also important to mention that the session is being recorded. So if you're uncomfortable about being recorded and the recording being put online afterwards, just put your questions or your answers in the chat rather than speaking out loud. But you're very welcome to ask questions at any point. Please also tell me if I'm going too fast or too slow. Okay. So there are two sessions. Today's session really is the absolute basics, fundamentals of how to construct a paper. And an awful lot of what I'm going to tell you is actually comes out of three editorials that I've written based on the courses that I teach. All of these have been published in Functional Ecology. So there's Essentials of Effective Scientific Writing, and then Demonstrating a Significant Advance of the Field, which was published in just this December, and The Anatomy of an Excellent Review Paper, which deals mostly with review papers, but a lot of the techniques that are relevant there are also very relevant for, say, an introduction and a discussion for a paper. And then some of the techniques that I'm going to show are also included in this book by Joshua Schimmel, Writing Science, which I recommend as a resource if you're really interested and you really want to know things in more detail and do some more practical exercises. So today really is about taking a different look at a paper. What is a paper? What are we doing? And what do we really need to think about for each section of the paper? And how do we make sure that we get our messages across? And one of the most important things here is quite simply that your research aims really should guide the writing process. The diagram I've just shown you here kind of encapsulates that. You can see that the question or the hypotheses, so the aims, answering the question or testing the hypotheses, they're really, really central to the whole writing process. And all of the sections of the paper really need to be framed or focused on these things. So the introduction provides the context for the research question and all the information needed to justify the hypotheses. This is really important, and we'll look at it in more detail in a moment. But I see a lot of introductions that they give me a really good overview of the subject area, but they don't supply the right information to justify why I'm doing this research and to justify my hypotheses. Then the methods demonstrates how the study design and the measurements will answer the question or test the hypotheses. So how do the methods help me meet my research aims? Then the results provide the empirical evidence that I need to answer my question or test my hypotheses. So again, the results are providing that empirical evidence about whether I've met my research aims. And the discussion shows then how your results answer that question, how you've tested the hypotheses, whether you've rejected any, whether you found evidence to support them, and places all of the results in context. And I've put this dashed line here between the discussion and the introduction because actually the discussion links back to the information I've provided in the introduction. So you can see from the diagram, we're kind of coming full circle, starting from our research aims and really bringing those research aims into every single section of the paper. And this is a really good starting point. Now, because the research aims are a really good starting point, one thing I'm often asked is what's better, research questions or hypotheses? And should I put both in the paper? And there's a very general rule of thumb. If you have very clear expectations of what the outcome of the study will be based on the information you have at hand, then you can formulate hypotheses. So your expectations become hypotheses. If there is very little previous information on the topic and you don't really know what you might expect from your results, then you pose questions. And of course, it's almost always better to formulate hypotheses if you can. And in the interests of conciseness, I don't recommend including both questions and hypotheses. One nice way of doing it is that you have an overarching question and overarching aim for the whole study, and then you break that down into specific hypotheses that you're going to test. But if you can formulate hypotheses, then that's better. What's really important here is that hypotheses need to be specific and they need to be testable. So how do we formulate a specific testable hypothesis? And here's kind of the first question to you. You can vote on this with hands up. My question is, how is dung beetle abundance influenced by edge effects in tropical forests? I've got two options for hypotheses. The first one, hypothesis 1A, dung beetle abundance will change due to edge effects. And hypothesis B, dung beetle abundance will increase with distance to the forest edge. So only one of these two hypotheses is really specific and testable. So I'd like to see, with a show of hands, who thinks hypothesis A is better in a paper? If you can use the hands up button to vote. And who thinks hypothesis B is better? Great. Yes, hypothesis B is definitely specific and it's testable. Hypothesis A certainly isn't. So one of the good sort of, again, rules of thumbs for specific and testable hypotheses is that they almost always include the magnitude of the effect and the direction of the expected effect. So in this case, we think abundance will increase with distance to the forest edge. So there we have the direction of the effect, an increase, and we've also given distance to the forest edge as our kind of measure for that increase. So that's all I'm going to say to hypotheses, because obviously the one of the first and last things we need to think about is writing the abstract. So now we've got our hypotheses, we can get going with the writing. And I often write the abstract last. I find it very useful to write the abstract when I've got the rest of the paper and I can kind of write a summary of the rest of the whole paper. But it's also really good to have kind of a draft abstract as the first step of the writing process, because it can help order your thoughts and really crystallize those key messages. So you should have a very good idea of what your paper is going to contain before you start writing. You should have an idea of the story you want to tell, and actually writing an abstract can help you stick to that. So the first step is the draft abstract to help structure your paper, and then when you finally finish writing the rest of the paper, you can rewrite the abstract to make sure that you really have covered the key points and incorporated any changes. I also find it quite hard to write the abstract because it's short. We're often limited to, say, 300 or 350 words. We need to really find the essence of the paper and fit it into a very short piece of text. And I'm not very good at that. I'm not very good at being concise. And so I always start with a much longer abstract where I say everything I think I want to say, and then I cut and I cut again and I cut again until I'm really only left with the essential points to fit the word limit. What's really important about the abstract and getting the abstract right is that it tells us, it tells the reader whether or not the paper is interesting. So it is often the first and possibly the only thing that the editor will read when you submit your paper. So we make a lot of our decisions about whether the paper fits to the journal based on the abstract. Then, of course, it's the only thing that reviewers receive before they decide if they want to review the paper. And it's definitely the first thing that most other researchers will read, and it could be the only thing they read when doing a search. People will read the abstract to decide, is the rest of the paper worth reading? So the abstract really needs to contain all the relevant information about the context, the relevance, and of course the key take-home messages of the study. So getting the abstract right is pretty important. And we can think of the abstract as the key points of the paper in a sort of easily digestible form. We usually structure it as a brief background or a justification for the study, so that the context, and then a broad description of what the study actually is. Is it an experiment? Is it a gradient study? Is it observations? Is it modeling? The main findings, so the most important results, and then usually a final statement showing why the study is relevant. A lot of people forget this final statement, and it's actually absolutely key for a lot of readers and for editors in deciding, is your paper interesting to them? So the structure the BES journals use is really useful. So it's the abstract is often divided into individual paragraphs, numbered paragraphs, and the final paragraph should be kind of a synthesis or the conclusions of the study. So here you can see on this example from functional ecology, 4 paragraphs in the abstract, and they really are the key points. So a very brief background that provides the context and shows the knowledge gap that the study is going to address. Then a very broad description of the methods. So here, laboratory and greenhouse, bioassays, which plants, which organisms, but that's as much detail as is really needed. The main results of the study, and then at the end, the relevance. So here, our results lead to the counterintuitive insight that removing instead of introducing plant defense traits can result in superior protection against important pests through biological control. So a really, a single sentence, key statement, this is why this is important. And in this case, they've used the word counterintuitive to highlight that this is a surprising result that people should be interested in. So the abstract, that's, sort of the essence of the abstract. These 4 sort of main sections to your abstract, 4 or 5 very short paragraphs, if possible, and you should be within the 300 or 350 word limit. but it really needs to contain the essence of the paper. Then the title obviously goes with the abstract, and that's also a hook for the reader. So the title, if you're scrolling through journal content alerts, often again, you will decide on the title whether or not this paper is interesting to you. And a good title is brief and clear, and it needs to say what the paper is about. And very often the title should summarize the main finding of the paper. I'm not a fan, for example, of questions in titles. It's very popular to use questions in titles, but for me as an editor and for me as a reader, it doesn't tell me what the study found and what the important finding is. It tells me what the research question was. And that to me is a lot less interesting than the actual finding. There's also a joke in scientific circles and I guess editorial circles that if the title is a question, the answer is going to be no, because otherwise you would have put the main finding of the paper if it were really interesting. So some people like questions. Personally, I don't think they're effective titles. So what is an effective title? And I have two sort of short questions or a short quiz here. Don't worry about who the authors are. I want your honest opinion. Is this a good title? Put your hands up if you think it's not a good title of a paper. Okay, so quite a few people think this is not a good title. So it tells me what the study is. Who thinks it is a good title? Who thinks it's clear and it's got a strong take-home message? Okay, we're definitely on the not a good title. So a good title has a very clear take-home message, and this one doesn't. So this tells us what the paper is about, but it doesn't provide any take-home messages. And it's with this particular paper, it's quite hard, but a better title might have been Litter Removal Reveals the Importance of Litter Fall for Nitrogen, Phosphorus and Potassium Cycling in a Lowland Tropical Forest. That would have been a much better title. But, you know, I was still a PhD student and I was still learning when this paper was first written. So, well, not a very good title. Okay. Second quiz. How about this one? Is this a good title? Who thinks it is a good title? Oh, no hands. Great. It isn't a very good title. So this one does have a take-home message, but it's very weak. It tells us that the litter manipulation has an effect, but it doesn't tell us what the effect is. So in this case, a better title might be Litter addition enhances early stage decomposition and mesoarthropod abundance in a lowland tropical forest. So, you know, these are two examples from my own papers where I've not known how to write a title and what's involved in a good title, but it really is a good title has a very clear take-home message, and a good title tells you what the key findings of the study are. And that then generates interest in the paper. People will then hopefully click on the paper, read the abstract, and then decide whether or not to read on. So the abstract and the title go hand in hand. It's your advertisement for the paper. That's how you get your readers to continue reading. So let's assume that you've hooked your reader, you've got your readers, you've got a good abstract, a good title, a good abstract, and they've decided it's worth reading the rest of the paper. So now we have to think about the introduction. And the introduction really is the background and the rationale for your study. It's not a literature review, and that is really, really important, because a lot of us as students were taught to write a literature review as an introduction, and we continue doing this. And I see so many papers that are submitted to functional ecology that are full of information it's really interesting. And you know, if I want to know more about the subject area and the background, but it's not relevant to the paper. And when I start including information that isn't directly relevant to the study, I'm misleading the reader, or I'm confusing the reader, because the reader will think, oh, this is relevant to the study, and they keep reading and then they're like, hang on a minute, why was that included in the introduction? So a good way to think about the introduction really is setting the scene. So you're providing a background, the background information the reader needs to understand why you've done the work, and what the motivation is for the work. It also tells the reader why they should be interested in the work. So this might be, you know, we've always thought that this is, you know, already established, but actually there's evidence that it might not be like that. So showing us something unexpected, showing a knowledge gap, showing a problem that we need to solve. So telling the reader why they should be interested in the study and its outcomes. And the introduction is really a logical train of thought that leads the reader to the conclusion that the study is novel, it's exciting, and it's worth doing. So what the introduction isn't is everything you know or want to say on the subject. That's always very tempting, especially when we find the topic really interesting. It's not a literature review, and it's not a place for methodological detail. So it can be good to give a little bit of sort of an outline of methods in the introduction, just to say what the study is about, how you've tested a certain question, for example, with a field study, but it should be a very brief outline in 1 or 2 sentences at most. No methodological detail. And another thing that I see an awful lot is very, very long introductions. And you don't need a long introduction. In fact, a really good introduction is 4 paragraphs. 4 long paragraphs, but 4 paragraphs. So you can get the entire introduction to your paper down to 4 paragraphs, maximum 5. You've done a good job of distilling the essential information and providing context for your study. And one way of thinking about this is to sort of divide up the paragraphs into 4 sort of broad themes. So first of all is why the topic is important. So in the broadest sense that's relevant. So are we talking about global change? Is it that broad? Or are we talking about a specific issue in a specific country? Are we talking about a specific problem for a certain research area or with a certain species? That's the starting point. Then we narrow down to the specific scientific context that the study is going to look at. We then think about what the key knowledge gaps are, or what the specific problem is that the study is going to address. And then we come to the actual study itself, and we end the introduction with the aims and hypotheses. And a really good way of thinking about this is using this concept of funneling. So we start broad. So for a lot of my work, it's tropical forests are globally important store of carbon. So I'm really starting broad. I'm starting in the broadest possible sense. Then I'm narrowing down to the scientific context. In this case, it could be climate change is altering tropical tree growth, or interactions between plants and soil in tropical forests. Then the key knowledge gaps that I'm going to address with my study. So we don't know how this works in tropical forests, this particular thing. And then I'm going to address this with my study in a tropical, experimental study in a tropical forest. These are my aims. Here are my hypotheses. So we really are going from this all tropical forests globally to and narrowing it down to the study in a kind of a funnel form. And this concept, starting big and finishing small, you see I've got it at the bottom of the screen here, start big, finish small. I'm going to mention that a lot. I'm going to mention that a lot in this session, and I'm going to mention it a lot next week, because this is a really good technique. Funneling information is a very good technique for making sure that your reader can follow your line of reasoning. And that's absolutely essential for them understanding the paper. So you can think about your writing always as, when I start a new section or a new paragraph, or I start my paper, I start my introduction, I'm giving the context that the reader needs to understand my study. I'm giving the broad context so that the reader can understand the narrower scientific context. I'm giving the narrower scientific context so the reader understands why these knowledge gaps are important. And I'm giving the knowledge gaps so the reader understands why my study that's going to fill these knowledge gaps is worth doing and interesting. Okay. So I'd like to show you an example. Obviously, you don't have to read this. This is an older paper from Journal of Applied Ecology that's just, it gives quite a nice example. And you can see here with the colours and numbers, I've basically here outlined, first paragraph is split over those 2 pages, second, third and fourth. So really this entire paper is introduced with a 4-paragraph introduction. And to show you this in a little bit more detail, the first paragraph is the global context. So here we have, for several decades, eutrophication has constituted the most serious problem facing water managers in densely populated areas. So we're not limited here to a specific region. Eutrophication is a problem worldwide. So we've got here also lakes all over the world. So we now know we're talking about lakes. And then one of the nice things the authors have done here is partway down this paragraph, they've already started going into or funneling the information. So we've started off global, we're now coming into Europe, and then they provide the information about Europe. Once they've done that, we come to the scientific context. In this case, it's high internal loading of phosphorus. So we've gone from all pollution in lakes to phosphorus pollution. So we're already narrowing down the subject. Then in the knowledge gaps, they start talking about lake restoration techniques. So how do we restore lakes from eutrophication, from this phosphorus pollution, and which methods work better? And then we come to the study aims, an overview of the different types of restoration, and evaluate the results in the context of international projects. So this is a really nice structure for the introduction. We've presented a global problem. We've shown how it's specifically relevant in Europe. We've then narrowed down to phosphorus pollution as sort of the scientific issue that we're trying to address. We've shown that there are different techniques that you might use to address this. We don't know which one works best. And then we get to the study. Okay, by the time we get to the 4th paragraph, we know this study is going to be about lake restoration from phosphorus pollution, and it's going to tell us a little bit, it hopefully will tell us which restoration techniques work best. So this is a really nice example of funneling the information from broad to narrow, big to small, and creating a lovely logical flow of information to guide the reader. So this is an exercise for you to try at home. You can basically write an outline for the introduction to your paper with 4 bullet points. So the first one, global context, you can write one sentence. What am I going to put in the first paragraph in general to give this global context? Then what am I going to give for scientific context? What's relevant? What is the issue of the knowledge gap? And then obviously introducing the study, the research aims, and the hypotheses. And then basically, once you've got these 4 bullet points, you can use them as a guide to write the rest of the text. So writing an introduction can be this simple. Of course, this is a classic 4-paragraph introduction. It's good to be a little bit flexible. So the first 3 paragraphs might actually work better combined into 2. You might be able to combine, it might make sense, for example, to combine the global context and the scientific context into 1 paragraph, or the scientific context with the knowledge gap. That's fairly flexible. And it's also really important to point out that if you have a complex study, and in ecology many of us do, then you might need a 5th paragraph to make sure that you're really introducing all of the relevant background that the reader needs. So again, in my case, because I do a lot of work on plant-soil interactions, I frequently need a 5th paragraph because I'm talking about above ground processes and below ground processes and interactions. And because of this complexity, I need a little bit more space to make sure that I can introduce all of the background that I need to. But if your introduction is much longer than 5 paragraphs, you probably need to shorten it, and you need to think about whether all of the information you've included is really relevant. Okay. Before I move on, does anyone have any questions at this point? If you do, please type them into the chat or just raise your hand if you're happy to speak. But just checking that everything is clear and nobody has any questions.
I think we've just got a question in the chat, Emma.
Okay. Yes, I can see. Where are we? Okay. Got here. In Peru, many professors are still insisting that the title should include the location, region, and country of the study. I have always seen that this is far less common in papers published in English. What is your opinion? My opinion on that is that it should be included in the title if it's relevant. But by including the country and the region in the title, you're suggesting that your results might only be relevant to that region. So it's quite a difficult one without knowing the content of the paper, but a title, you want a title to be broad, but not misleading. So if it is important that the findings are for that location or region or country, then fine. But better would be, for example, the ecosystem. So, you know, instead of saying this is a study from this particular region in Peru, could you put this is a study, you know, from on montane ecosystems, or I don't know, something a little bit broader instead of saying it's this specific region in Peru. So in general, what you want to think about is, who do you want to read the paper? Do you want other researchers working on the same system to read your paper, or would you like everybody who's working on similar systems or similar species to read your paper? And if you want a lot more people to read your paper than just those working in that region or system, then it's probably better to leave it out. If your results are really only relevant to that region or that country, then it probably needs to go in the title. Hopefully that answers the question. Regarding references, how many, and is it necessary to cite old papers, is the next question. Yeah, I'm not going to talk about references much. I'd refer you to my editorial about writing review papers, because I do talk about references there. How many? Yeah, that's the how long is a piece of string question, again, it depends on the paper. It depends on the subject. It depends on the prior information. What is important, I mean, you know, you need to be able to back up arguments, provide evidence, and provide context. So including lots and lots and lots of references just because they've got one sentence somewhere in the paper is not very good. Your references should really provide some evidence to back up the statements, and not just, oh, all of these people have said the same thing, but actually these papers have shown empirical evidence to support this particular statement. And that's a good way of thinking about it. As a rule of thumb, I usually say, you know, to provide evidence for a statement, anything between 1 and 3 references. But if a lot of people have worked on a topic and you want to show that this is an important topic by demonstrating that a lot of people have worked on it, then obviously you give more citations for that point. The second question about, is it necessary to cite old papers? If those old papers are the first people to show a certain concept, then yes. So seminal papers, papers where people really provided novel information that has guided your research question, then yes, you should include old papers, definitely. In general, you should try and aim for a range of papers that are relevant to the subject matter. So going back as far as is sensible. So if, for example, if you're working on I don't know, Jansen-Connell effects, then you need to you really should provide some of the original papers dealing with Jansen-Connell effects, because people are still working on it decades later, and everybody is citing those seminal papers because they're important. They were an important foundation. Okay. I think that was it with the, yes, I think that was it with the questions, I hope. Yes, right. Good, thank you very much. I will continue in that case on the methods. But do try this exercise at home for writing the introduction, and have a look at one of the things that I always advocate to everybody interested in improving their writing is pick some papers that you really like. Pick some papers that you think are convincing, are well written, and study them. Have a look and see how, you know, how many papers that you enjoy and you found useful and easy to read have this particular structure in the introduction, for example. So methods. The methods is often quite tricky, and again, it's this problem that we're completely immersed in our study subject, and for us it's so clear that that what we've done is make sense, and you know, we've been working on this often for years before we produce the paper. It's quite hard to remember what it's like not to know and not to be intimately familiar with the study. So a really good way of thinking about the method section is that it's like a recipe, right? It's like a cookbook. It's the recipe that other people can follow to get the same conclusions as you did. So one of the really important things about methods is getting the level of detail right. And essentially, the method should provide enough information for the reader to really understand how the study addresses the research aims and questions. So you remember, they're central to our writing process. How do our methods, how does the design help us address those questions? And is the methodology and the data analysis appropriate? And again, you can think about preempting reviewer comments. What information do you need to provide the reviewer to give them confidence in your results? So we can think about this in terms of reproducibility. The details that you provide in the method section should allow the reader to get a picture of your study and recreate each step. So getting the details right is the tricky thing. How much detail do I really need to include? And again, the rule of thumb is you should include any details that influence the data collection, the approach you use to analyze the data, and obviously the results and their interpretation. So one example that I always give is that, we often tag things, right? Ecologists tag all kinds of things. I need to say that I tagged individuals if I'm doing repeated measurements and I need to go and find those individuals again. That's quite important, because then I'm demonstrating that I can find those same individuals and I can identify them multiple times. What isn't important is what type of tags I used. Did I use red tags? Did I use blue tags? I might want to say that I use waterproof tags or metal tags or something, just if I'm doing a long-term study. But it's that information is a lot less important than the fact that I tagged something and I could find it again. So that's just kind of an example. Examples of absolutely crucial details: the sampling sites and experimental treatments, the level of replication, the type, number, and size of sampling units, and the number of samples and the frequency of sample collection. And of course, this also applies if you're only collecting data rather than actual samples. And you'd be surprised at how many of these absolutely crucial details often get forgotten in the methods. So one thing you can do is to ask yourself whether you think the method section gives the reader a picture of the study. Can you visualize the study design and the procedures based on the description you've given? And could you draw a figure or diagram of the study design or the procedure based on the description in the text? One reason this is a sort of a helpful thing to ask: if I'm reviewing a paper and I find the methods poorly written and I'm getting confused and I don't really know what the authors have done, I will try and draw a diagram. I will actually try and draw like a timeline or a little drawing, a little plan, little map of what I think the study design is, especially if it includes things like treatments and sub-treatments and subplots and those kind of things. And if I can't draw the study design based on the text, as a reviewer, I would tell the authors that they've got to include more detail and they've got to be much clearer about how the setup of the study works. One way you can really help the reader, especially if you have a complicated experiment or a complicated study, is to summarize the sites, the sampling units, the treatments, and the replicates at the end of the relevant section. So you give the full description, and then at the end, you can say, in total, there were this many treatments or this many replicates of this many treatments spread across this many plots, for example. So just in one sentence, summarize those details, and that really helps the reader create a picture of the study. A second tip is again, start big, finish small. So you'll often see in papers, the first thing everybody writes is the study site, and they give the climate, and they might give the soil type, or they might give the bedrock or something like that. But you always start big, the whole site. This is the region or the area or the continent that I did my study on. This is what's relevant. This is the broader climate, and then this is the specific site. Then these are the plots or the general setup. These are the treatments, these are the sub-treatments, and then these are the measurements we made. So here again, we're starting big and broad, and we're building in more and more details and more complexity as we go along. So again, even in the methods, you can use this funneling technique, starting big and broad and finishing with details. Okay. So that's all I'm really going to say to the methods. moving on to the results section. The results section is kind of interesting because, again, as ecologists, we often we use a lot of statistics to provide evidence, and we want to provide our statistics, our findings as a factual report. Obviously, we're not interpreting at this point. That's usually left to the discussion section. But what is really important here is that we work out which results are the most important ones, and how do we highlight those? How do we make them easy to find? We often end up with a results section that has a lot of numbers in it, has a lot of statistics in it, and also has some results that we don't really want the reader to focus on. So I'm not saying bad results or something, but actually thinking about key results. So these are the novel findings that you're really going to discuss when you get to your discussion section. These are the things you're going to interpret. And then you have supporting results. So these ones lend weight or provide evidence for your interpretation of the key results and to support your conclusions. So one of the things that that I often measure is decomposition or soil respiration. The subject of my paper is then decomposition or soil respiration. And of course, I've measured soil water content, I've measured temperature, I might have measured nutrients because these are relevant to the process, but they're not the focus of the paper. So really important with the results is remembering why you're reporting them and what you want to highlight. And again, linking the results back to your questions or hypotheses is a really good way of doing this, even if it's not obvious. So you might not write, you know, these results provide evidence for evidence to support hypothesis 3 or something, but you are thinking about how which results are really providing the test of those hypotheses or answering some of your research questions, and then structuring the results text around how you've answered those questions or hypotheses. So remembering that you're providing empirical evidence to answer your questions or address your research aims is a good way to think about your results section. And like I said, we use a lot of statistics, and this is really important not to get lost in the statistics. What we need to remember is statistics are a tool, and they're there to support statements. They're not, we don't give statements to support statistics. And I'll show you an example in a moment. But basically, the other thing is also to remember to give the magnitude and the direction of effects. So I often see something in the paper like X and Y were significantly different. And this tells me nothing. It doesn't tell me how they were different. It doesn't tell me whether X was bigger than Y or Y was bigger than X. So actually putting this, X was 15% higher than Y, and then giving the statistics, that's a much better way of describing the result. So giving the magnitude and direction of effects, and you can see here 15% is the magnitude, that it's higher, and then I've got my p-value here in parentheses. And what is really important here is thinking about what your results mean ecologically, right? So what is the ecological meaning of these treatments and patterns and effects? And that will help the reader follow your results and interpret them and understand them. So instead of giving lots of numbers and saying, oh yeah, this is significantly different and this is significantly different, I'm really thinking back to my hypotheses, I'm thinking back to my aims, and I'm providing evidence in ecological language, not statistical language. And to kind of exemplify this, I have a quick exercise for you. I've got 2 alternative result statements on the next slide, and I'd like to know from you which one is really easier to read and understand, and why it's easier to read and understand. I'll give you a minute or so to read. It's 2 or 3 sentences per statement, and I can guarantee that you don't need to work in this subject area or understand the background of the paper to be able to answer these questions. Okay, so have a quick look, A and B, which one is easier to read, which one is easier to understand, and why. Now, once you've finished reading, you could type the answer into the chat. Yeah, it's very clear. Yeah. So we've got a good answer there. It's B is better. It includes the ecological aspects. B is better because it gives ecological context. Exactly. So this is a really important thing to think about, because I see an awful lot of that A there. And of course, here I've left out all the statistics, but you can imagine if I had a results statement like statement A, and then I have all of the statistics in there as well, it very quickly becomes really hard to understand. And the reason it becomes really hard to understand is that A is written in statistical terms. So for me, it's significantly positively correlated. I have to think for a moment. Okay, that means that whereas N concentrations increase, so does the NP ratio. And then that one's negatively correlated. And then the last one doesn't even tell me which direction the correlation goes. So rewriting this to just say foliar nitrogen concentrations declined with warming and irrigation, whereas foliar phosphorus increased, that is so much clearer. What I've also done here is you can see that this first sentence basically summarizes all of the following in a single statement that highlights the most important point. And again, you know, this is the same thing. It's this big to small again. I'm giving an overview. So foliar nitrogen to phosphorus ratios were influenced by shifts in the concentrations of both N and P depending on the global change driver. So I've basically just told the reader what they're going to read in the rest of the paragraph. I've given them a nice big broad overview. This is my key result, and then I'm breaking down the details. So again, it's this big to small, and this is like a topical sentence in the results to make sure that the reader can follow the details that I'm about to throw at them. I've just seen a question in the chat that some editors do not like using words like interestingly because it's subjective. I think it's yes, you could say that it's subjective and it's personal, but actually in this case, because it was counterintuitive, this is something we weren't expecting. I think it's perfectly valid to include it. If the editor doesn't like it, then I would remove it, and I'd probably replace it with something like notably, because the reason we've used interestingly here in this sentence is quite simply we want to draw attention to this statement. And there are lots of words. So I've also been told don't use surprisingly. It's like, why not? It's a surprise. This is not what we were expecting, and we've laid out our expectations. But you know, you pick your battles. take out the word surprisingly, but there are words like interestingly, surprisingly, notably that you can use because you want to draw the reader's attention to this particular statement. But yeah, it depends a little bit on reviewers, editors, and personal preference. So basically, using a topical sentence at the start of each paragraph in the results is a really good way to provide context for the details that you're about to give. So again, starting big and finishing small. Always give the magnitude and the direction of effects. And, you know, with this start big, finish small, if you're working on something that's quite complex, start with general patterns and general findings, then introduce something like treatment effects, then introduce interactions. So again, it's not just big and small, it's also start simple and introduce complexity in steps, because that also helps the reader follow the line of reasoning. One thing that I tell all of my students and postdocs to do is to write the first draft of their results based on figures only. So take your figures, create some nice figures, sit down, write the entire text based on what you can see in the figures, and then fill in the statistics. And that way you avoid the statistical language, you're concentrating better on the ecological meaning. And it also means that when the readers refer to your graphs to find evidence for the results, they will see them. It also means that you can, whether your graphs are effective. So effective figures show the results at first glance. If you have effective figures, you should be able to write most of your results section without the output of statistical tests. You can add all the numbers in afterwards. And I always write my results section based on figures only. I also always tell my students, if my students come to me with an R script and an output and a load of statistics and say, look, here are my results, I'm like, where are the graphs? I want to see the graphs, I don't want to see the statistics. So if I can't see something in a figure, I don't believe the statistics. And that brings us to figures and tables in the results. So as I said, figures should show the most important results at a glance. The graph here, it's obviously a bit of a joke, but you can see very, very clearly that as the number of publications declines, the beer consumption increases. How it's plotted, you could say you're drinking more because you have fewer publications, or your beer drinking is contributing to the number of publications you write, but the relationship is really, really clear. Tables are best used for summary data, things like site statistics, and your supporting results, your supporting data. And a good tip is if you have a section of the results that is really just a long, long list of numbers, then you probably want a summary table or a nice table instead. So how do we draw effective figures? There is actually a whole paper on this in PLOS Computational Biology, and that's obviously partly focused on computational biology. Here adapted 7 points for effective figures. The first is obviously to put yourself in your reader's shoes. It is really important always to try and remember what it's like not to know everything about this study and how to show it to your reader. The second is identifying your message. What do you want the reader to see? Which effects do you need them to see? How are you supporting your results by visualizing them and showing them to the reader? Then you need to provide really clear self-explanatory legends, which I'll come on to in a moment. Use color and symbols effectively. So it's great to have lots of colour graphs and make things look really nice, but the important thing is always that you're highlighting results with the figures and not that the figures are beautiful themselves. Then, of course, you should never mislead the reader. Your figures should always show or shouldn't distort the results, make effects look bigger than they actually are, and so on and so forth. You want to avoid clutter. You want to make sure that they're nice and clean so that the reader can see the important results at a glance. And then message over beauty. A simple line and scatter plot is often just as effective as something really nifty with lots and lots of colour. So really thinking about what is the best way to show the results to the reader. Now, figure and table legends should be self-explanatory. And that basically means that somebody who hasn't read the paper should be able to understand the figure or the table just by reading the legend. This is quite important because often a lot of readers will skip a lot of the results section. They will look at the figures first. And if they haven't read the results section or they haven't read the method section of the paper, they still need to be able to understand what they can see in the figures and the tables. This figure is real. It's from this 1993 paper in European Neurology, and all it says is the underpant worn by the rat. And at this point, we have no idea about why the underpant, or why the rat's even wearing underpants, let alone why this is relevant or what it's about. So, because we haven't read the paper. So someone who hasn't read the paper should be able to understand the figure by reading the legend. And I have an example here from one of our papers. And it would be great if you could write in the chat, what kind of things do you need to know to understand this figure and what we're trying to show in this figure? What do we need to explain in the legend? So if you've got an idea of what we need to include in the legend, pop it in the chat. Okay, so what is L minus CT and L plus? Yep. What are the colours? Yep. What are the colours? Anything else? Are the circles outliers? Yep. Where have we measured methane flux? Absolutely. Yep. So far we have location, colours, symbols, abbreviations. Anything else? When? Yes, week of the year is not particularly helpful, especially if you don't know even which year and you're not familiar with week numbers. Yep. So basically, obviously, the location of the experiment, when it was carried out, all abbreviations, symbols, lines, colours, and then obviously we often need to give things like means, errors, sample sizes, and any other key information that you need to understand this figure. I've seen the request about results in review papers. I can talk about that very briefly in a moment. So basically, all the information we need to include in this legend is here. So you can see we have soil methane fluxes under individuals of 2 common tree species. The tree species are the colours. I've then given the treatments and with their abbreviations. I've said it's in a tropical forest in Panama, measured weekly from March to July 2014. I've also put during the transition from the dry season, and I've put the week numbers to the wet season. This is really important for the study. And then I've given ranges, median lines, and the sample size. And I haven't actually, in this one, it doesn't actually mention the outliers, but it's absolutely correct that we should mention that the circles are outliers. And I just wanted to highlight something here, or two things here. First of all, I've started this legend with a very simple statement that's basically soil methane fluxes under individuals of two common tree species. So as soon as the reader reads the first line of the legend, they know what they're looking at in very broad terms. Then I've given the species, then I've given the treatments, then I've given the time period, and then I've given all the other details, right? So I've started with a brief summary, telling the reader what they're looking at. And of course, I've structured this legend the same way that I'm structuring all the other information in the paper. I've started with a big statement showing the most important result, the most important information the reader needs to understand everything else. And I've finished with the little details that aren't, you know, I mean, they're important, but they're not stuff I really want to highlight to the reader. So they're important because I'm giving them, for example, the number of replicates and what my ranges and median lines are, and so on. But that's the small detail that comes at the end. So results from review papers. It's a difficult one. I wrote the editorial about review papers because they are a lot more flexible than a research paper. So when we're writing research papers, we've got this fixed structure, and we've usually got these fixed sections, and we kind of know exactly how to structure the information. That's a lot harder in review papers because you've got more flexibility. So I definitely recommend that you obviously read the editorial about writing a review paper, but in general, the principles are all the same. So you need to highlight the key results. You need to structure the information in the same way, broad to narrow, and really decide on what is the essence of the review paper. What is the review paper trying to achieve? What's its purpose? And then the results that come out of the review, so whether that's identifying new patterns or showing links between different subject areas, or whatever the purpose of the review is, that then becomes your key results that you need to highlight. And you basically highlight them in exactly the same way. It's just that the structure is more flexible. Does that sort of answer the question? I think if you want more specific than that, I probably need a slightly more specific question. But yeah, it's obviously you're in a review paper, you would be providing the results often without statistics, unless it's a meta-analysis, in which case you follow the exact same principles as you would for any other research paper. But yeah, it's the structuring this information in this way works for anything, pretty much. So any kind of non-creative writing. If you're writing a review paper, you're writing a report, you're writing a perspectives or a commentary, you're writing a job application letter. These structures work pretty much everywhere. That's why they're so powerful, because they are helping the reader understand the flow of information. Okay, great. Right. On to the discussion before we run out of time. The discussion is really quite important. It's difficult. It is hard to write a discussion, and I think it took me a long time to learn to write a really good discussion. It's difficult because, again, the discussion, like a review paper, is a little bit more flexible. It's a bit more fluid, and it's the chance to really make your study stand out, okay, and really show what it means. And I like to think of the discussion as my playground. So I find it difficult to write, but it's my favorite part of the paper, because this is where I can make the most of my results. I can put my results in context and I can show why they're important. So a really good discussion synthesizes the results with the published evidence and uses solid evidence, whether that's my results or from the literature, to interpret my findings. And again, the discussion, you may remember right at the beginning, I showed this graph linking all the sections of the paper, and there was a link dotted line between the discussion and the introduction, because the information you've provided in the introduction is also relevant for how you're going to discuss your results. So your discussion actually links back to those topics that you've provided in the introduction. So you're linking your results to the wider context, the knowledge gaps, and obviously the research aims and hypotheses. This aspect of synthesis is difficult, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next session. The discussion itself, I like to think of it as the essence of the paper. I personally think it's the most important part of a paper, because it's interpreting the findings, it's putting them in context, you're showing how the results address the aims and hypotheses, and you're demonstrating how your findings add to the existing knowledge, how you're advancing the research field, and you're highlighting knowledge gaps and directions for future work. So for me, this really is the essence of the paper. What should a good discussion look like? Well, first of all, it really should show whether or not I've met my research aims. That's pretty key. Then you should obviously discuss whether you filled any of the knowledge gaps that you highlighted in the introduction, or have you resolved any of the issues? Have you made steps towards resolving them? How do your findings fit into other research on this topic, so into the literature, and how do they add to it? This is also really important. How have you gone beyond what we knew and shown something additional, or provided additional information that is helpful to the research community? Have you answered all your questions, or are there some left that still need to be answered? Have new questions emerged from your work? That's also quite important. And of course, what is the wider relevance of your results? What are the implications of your results? So these are things that a good discussion should address in sort of very general terms. And I'd like to have a quick look at the kinds of discussion that I often see as an editor or as a reviewer that really make a weak discussion and should be avoided. So the way I was taught to write a discussion as a student was to basically discuss my results sequentially. And I wasn't really taught to put them in context, in wider context. So the results are basically more or less repeated. Often in some papers, the results section will be unreadable statistics, and then the actual results in ecological terms pop up in the discussion. So if the results are repeated, discussed sequentially, and they're not put in context, the reader can't see how your results have answered your research questions or how the work advances the field. So a really good tip here is to structure your discussion around your hypotheses, your questions, or your aims, and show how your results address those aims, and then obviously interpret and explain the results by reference to previous work or your other results, supporting results, for example. The second sign of a weak discussion is when the findings are presented as a piece of evidence, but the relevance is really only revealed at the end. This is really, really common in all the Latin languages, that basically it's a detective story. There's, oh yes, there's this result and this result and this result and this result. And then at the end, there's the big reveal. All of this together means that. And in English, we don't work like that, or this is not what readers expect to read. So the reader gets confused because you're giving them lots of details without the context they need to understand the details. And the links between the evidence and the relevance are unclear because you're giving the evidence before you've really addressed the relevance of the details that you're providing. So a really good way of avoiding this is to start each paragraph with the take-home message. So, you know, actually say, what is that? What is the big finding? And then present the steps, the evidence. And of course, you can repeat it at the end, but by giving this topical sentence that is a take-home message about the results, and then building in the detail and providing the evidence for that statement, you've given the reader context and you're helping them follow your line of reasoning. So again, start big, finish small. And at the end, if you want, you can write a concluding sentence that hammers that message home. Then another type of discussion I see an awful lot of is that the results are discussed by comparison to other published work. There's often very little interpretation. So I'll see, oh yes, these results are similar to this other research group, but they differ from this research group. And as a reader, I'm going, well, why are they similar to that system, but different from that system? And what's new about this, right? So here, the issue is that the reader can't see the relevance of your work. So you're actually highlighting other people's work instead of highlighting your own. And so the advance that you've made with your study and the relevance of your study is completely unclear to the reader. So a good way of doing this is synthesizing the results with the published findings to show how you fill the knowledge gaps. And like I said, this concept of synthesizing is quite abstract and quite hard to picture in your mind. So I am going to talk about a little bit more about this, at least in brief, next week. But actually pulling together your results with other people's results to really interpret the findings and show how you've tested your hypotheses, how you've addressed knowledge gaps is a way to avoid this type of weak discussion. Then, of course, the last type of weak discussion is where the discussion is just too speculative. So results are overinterpreted and the interpretation is very speculative. I see this an awful lot with, especially with junior authors who feel they need to explain everything, and you don't. You are interpreting your results and providing explanations for the things for which you have direct, concrete evidence. And yes, you can speculate a bit, but you want to keep that to a minimum and use it to your advantage. Too much speculation, too much interpretation, and too much reliance on, for example, other people's data to interpret your own work means that the reader loses confidence in your results. So the interpretation relies on variables that were not measured, for example, or insufficient evidence is presented to support your conclusions in this type of speculative discussion. And one way of avoiding this, like I said, limit the speculation to the bare minimum, but also if you really need to speculate for lack of evidence, you might be able to describe that as a new hypothesis or a direction for future research. So you've got this interesting result, you can't interpret it, you haven't found any other papers that might be able to help you interpret it, therefore it's something that we might need to know. So that's a good way of addressing this problem. Then, of course, structuring the discussion is really important. The text structure throughout the paper is important. And again, we're thinking about starting big and finishing small in each paragraph throughout the discussion. But basically, it's often really nice to start with a short paragraph that summarizes the main findings of the study, puts them in context, and then tells the reader what you're going to discuss. So it might be, you know, we've shown this. This is important for, I don't know, climate change. And here we're going to discuss the potential mechanisms. Or here we're going to discuss how our study provides potential mechanisms for this phenomenon, for example. Then start each paragraph with a very clear statement of the key findings that you're going to discuss. Within each paragraph, you then present your lines of evidence by synthesizing your results with the findings from published research. And the other thing it's really important in the discussion structure is to build in, if you have caveats and limitations, you want to give them in context. So you're presenting an important finding, you're interpreting it, you're saying, okay, there was this limitation in the study in context. And then you also always want to give a statement about why that limitation does not undermine confidence in the results. I often see papers, and you know, we teach students to do this, to put in a section that is limitations of the study. This is not a good idea. It's much better to give the limitations in context, to discuss them in context and show why they're not, they don't undermine the results. If you put them in a separate section at the beginning or the end of the discussion, you've just undermined yourself. So you're basically saying, oh, you know, we found all this great stuff, but there's this wrong and this wrong and this wrong and this one and this, and it psychologically it's a bad thing to do. Then of course you want to finish the discussion with conclusions about the wider relevance of the research. And this sort of concept of writing the conclusions and showing the broader relevance is something that that the most recent editorial from December deals with. And one way to think about the conclusions is basically the structure of your introduction in reverse. So here you're saying, you know, this is our study, this is what we did, and then you're working backwards. This is how it addresses these issues. This is how it fits in the scientific context, and this is why it's important. So you basically, if you think about the 4 paragraphs of your introduction, you've just put those more or less in reverse to write the conclusion section. What's important here is the conclusions should conclude things. And I often see conclusion sections that are basically a second abstract. And that's not what the conclusion section is for. The conclusion section does not need to be long. It doesn't even need to be a separate section. It could just be a short paragraph at the end of the discussion. But a way to think about the conclusions is quite simply, if you want the readers to remember only one thing from your paper, or 3 things maximum, what are they? That's what needs to go in the conclusions. Then, of course, why should they care? Why has the reader just spent the last half hour reading your paper and they've got to the end? Why should they care about what they've just read? Why should they be interested? And of course, what should we do next? How does your research lead to more research? So the absolute worst way to end the paper is to leave the reader thinking, well, so what, you know, what does this all mean? Why have you done this study? Why is this important? So that's a good way of thinking about writing the conclusions. And something that, you know, we look for at Functional Ecology and many other journals are looking for is how your research has advanced the field. And if you think about this, I mean, one of the things that, you know, journals work towards things like impact factors, whether we like it or not. It's important. It's important for submissions. We want more people to submit to the journals. We want to publish really good research. So what we're looking for are papers that are going to get cited by other researchers. That's kind of it, right? We're looking for things that will advance research because those are the papers that will get cited. We want to move research forwards. We want to be part of the research process. Okay, so an advance could be an important line of inquiry for future work. So you've shown that something really needs to be the subject of research in future. Or it might be that you've provided a completely new perspective on something or revealed a new phenomenon that now needs to be followed up. It could also be something that you've shown that everybody's assumed the wrong thing, and we might need to start rethinking about something. A study really advances the field when it actually motivates other people to fill knowledge gaps with new studies. So have you revealed a big knowledge gap that we really need to fill? And of course, it facilitates future work, for example, by exposing new issues, presenting new, improved methodology, demonstrating that old methodology hasn't provided the right results, and so on and so forth. So basically, a paper that advances the field simply leads to new research or creates change. So whether that's a change in the scientific approach, whether that's policy change, whether it's change in practice and applied ecology, that represents an advance. And how do we demonstrate this? So obviously we're going to demonstrate it in the discussion and conclusions, but we also need to think about putting it in the abstract, because that's what's going to generate research interest, sorry, for the research. We hopefully the advancing the field was the main justification for the study, and of course the main justification for the study goes at the end of the introduction, and then in the discussion and conclusions, how your research has advanced the field is one of the key take-home messages of the paper. So how do we demonstrate this advance? Well, obviously you can read the editorial, but you can also simply ask yourself, why should a researcher from another country or another research field read your paper? So this also answers the question about whether I should put the country or the region in the title. Do I want researchers from other countries, other research fields, and working in other ecosystems to read my paper, and what will they get out of it? Then what does your paper demonstrate that others haven't? And importantly, how is the research community going to benefit from your paper? We often think as papers as benefiting us, and we're writing them because we need to, because it's part of the research process. But actually, the reason we're communicating our research is so that the community as a whole can benefit from it, that we can build on it, and that we can move things forward. So a really good way to think about how you demonstrate the advance of the field is simply to ask yourself which aspects of the paper might be cited by other researchers in future. Why should other researchers be interested in your paper? Why should somebody working in, I don't know, tropical forest read a paper from temperate forest or savanna or cerrado or any other ecosystem, for example? Why should a researcher from Peru read a paper from China, or vice versa? So these things are really key to think about. I got a couple of questions. So in the discussion section, some reviewers do not like that we repeat results, but I see that in many papers. And what do you think? Are there any tips? Yeah, if it's just a repetition of results, then it's not good. Just repetition is not good. We often need to repeat results to be able to discuss them, but there is a way of doing it, which I will show in the next session. And one way to think about it is what I very often see in a discussion, and what I see from a lot of junior authors is there will be one sentence that repeats the result. We found this and this and this, right? And then in the next sentence, this means that, or, we interpret this to be, or this suggests that. So it's kind of separate, right? The result is repeated, and then in the next sentence, there's interpretation. And the best way to avoid repeating the results is quite simply to combine those two sentences. So, for example, our finding that X influenced Y indicates that, and then the interpretation. So I've taken my result, and I've already combined it with the interpretation. And that's a really good way of actually repeating your results without being repetitive. Okay, hopefully that helps. And like I said, I'll also talk a little bit about that in the next session. Then how is advancing the field different from the literature gap we would be writing after a literature review? I'm not entirely sure what you mean there. But yes, you're advancing the field basically by exposing a knowledge gap or exposing a gap. And in a literature review, you might do the same thing. So you might write a literature review to expose a gap that needs to be filled with research. So it is basically the same thing. And, you know, like I said, advancing the field, science is built on science, right? So somebody does some research, demonstrates something, and then someone else comes along and goes, oh, I think I could test this. I think this might be happening. I think I've got an idea for a mechanism, and then they will test that. And then they provide a hypothesis for the mechanism, and then someone else will come along and say, oh, I think they've got this wrong. I'm going to test that and see whether this alternative mechanism is actually more appropriate, and so on and so forth. So this is advancing the field. It's giving people new ideas. It's showing them the way forward. It's providing incentive for more research or for changes in the way we do things, for changes in policy, changes in practice, changes in methodology, and so on and so forth. So again, yes, there's a whole editorial on this. Okay, so I just managed to get through today's materials. I hope the pace was okay. I hope it was useful. I've just provided you with a very broad overview of a paper and a lot of context that is hopefully a good foundation for the session next week, where we'll actually look at structuring the text in more detail and how to really highlight those messages, synthesize statements, and so on. Are there any final questions? So any final questions, you can pop them in the chat. And I think you can, if you have questions afterwards, Amelia or Amaya, is there somewhere we can send questions to?
Hi, you're welcome to email them. If you email them to the functional inbox, and I can pass them on to Emma and we can get back to you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. One last question. Is it appropriate to write in the first person in the results and the discussion? Yes, I think writing I prefer writing in the first person. So we found, we have demonstrated, we showed. It's a lot more dynamic than writing in passive. So science used to be all written in passive, and now there is, especially in ecology, there's a very big push towards writing in active language. And there are various reasons for this. I think I also address it in the alternative guide to authors. It is basically, it's kind of owning the results, it's owning the research. It's also reminding the reader that there are people behind this research, that this was done by a research group, this was done by a person or a group of people, and that's not a bad thing. So great, and we now in the chat we have the functional ecology email address. If you have any more questions, I will do my very best to answer them, and hopefully I'll see you all next week.